Thanks very much for staying with us. Time now for Eye on Africa with me, Georgia Calvin-Smith. Tonight, strange and uncertain times. In Johannesburg, Barack Obama's words loom large at a ceremony marking the 100th year since Nelson Mandela's birth. Obama seemed to be referring to his successor, Donald Trump, in all but name, when he warns against those in power seeking to undermine that which gives democracy meaning. Also, the UN's Human Rights Office warns about escalating violence in Mali as it heads into elections later this month. Nearly 300 people are killed in intra-communal fighting this year alone. And Zimbabwe's MDC opposition says it will not be boycotting upcoming polls, despite accusations that the preparations have not been completely transparent. The democratic vote will be the first since the end of Robert Mugabe's 37-year rule. But first, thousands gathered in Johannesburg on Tuesday to celebrate the century since Nelson Mandela's birth. Crowds hung on the words of Barack Obama as he spoke of the late South African president's values of sacrifice and social justice. The former US president also used his highest profile speech since leaving office to warn against political dishonesty, a concern many have about his successor, Donald Trump.
People of South Africa.
A century since the birth of a global political icon. July 18, 2018 would have marked the 100th birthday of Nelson Mandela. The former South African leader, who led the fight against apartheid rule, was imprisoned for 27 years. He would go on to become the country's first democratically elected president in 1994. On the eve of Mandela Day, former US President Barack Obama honored his legacy by warning the world against the politics of fear and resentment.
Strongman politics are ascendant, suddenly, whereby elections and some pretense of democracy are maintained, the form of it, but those in power seek to undermine every institution or norm that gives democracy meaning.
While making no direct references to his successor, Obama slammed what some consider to be the hallmarks of Trump's presidency: climate change denial, controversial migration policies, and the rise of alternative facts.
People just make stuff up. They just make stuff up. We see it in the growth of state-sponsored propaganda. We see it in internet-driven fabrications. Look, let me say, politicians have always lied. But it used to be if you caught them lying, they'd be like, oh, man. Now they just keep on lying.
But at the end of his speech, Obama reminded the crowd to have hope, that the long arc of history inevitably bends towards justice.
Well, although Obama may have been referring obliquely to Trump's policies, the message against corruption and cynicism also resonated with many in his Johannesburg audience. Jane Flanagan tells us more.
We were looking for hints, some critique of Donald Trump, maybe thinly veiled. But what we got today was absolutely blatant. Donald Trump's name was not mentioned, as you say, but the clear inference was there. I think for a lot of South Africans, they took from the message, a lot of it seemed to refer to the president they've just got rid of, which was Jacob Zuma, who, of course, was an anti-intellectual, didn't put much weight on facts and investigations and intellectual rigor, who also was fast and free with the truth, and also could resort to a bit of xenophobia when it was politically expedient for him. So I think for a lot of South Africans, there were as many references for them to the strongmen in sub-Saharan Africa, as Jacob Zuma among them, as much as there were for Donald Trump. But certainly it was a lot more hard-hitting than we were expecting to hear today on the eve of the anniversary of Nelson Mandela's centenary.
Now, did all the attention on Obama's speech risk overshadowing Mandela's memory at all?
I think South Africans are quite open-minded about this. You may remember at Nelson Mandela's memorial service in 2013, that became completely hijacked as a political rally anti-Zuma, and it was a very politicized event. And I think that is the way things are in South Africa. We're in a very febrile, rather mercurial country where things unfold as they do. And I think that Cyril Ramaphosa today must have felt very buoyed by the reception he got, which was very spontaneous, very warm. There was some singing in favour of him today.
Dan Flanagan there for us in Cape Town. Now, the eve of the 100th anniversary of Nelson Mandela's birth also saw events being held elsewhere in the world. In London, British Prince Harry and his wife Meghan Markle visited an exhibition charting the late anti-apartheid icon's life. During the royal couple's visit, they met with Mandela's granddaughter, Zamaswazi Dlamini Mandela. The retrospective at the South Bank Centre was curated by Johannesburg's Apartheid Museum. Now, nearly 300 civilians have been killed in fighting between rival militia in Mali this year, with a sharp uptick in deaths being seen since May. The intercommunal violence comes as the country prepares for polls later this month that are meant to move the country on from 6 years of political unrest. But UN peacekeepers from the MINUSMA mission say that attacks by Dozon hunters on Fulani herders have escalated and that ethnic tensions are being exploited by al-Qaeda-linked jihadists. Rupert Colville from the UN Human Rights Commission tells us more about specific concerns for the Mopti region.
The UN Human Rights officers in Mali have documented almost 199 actually incidents of intercommunal violence across the country this year, but 3/4 of those incidents have taken place in this Mopti region in the central Mali. So that's really the main flashpoint. And there's been a very sharp spike in the number of those incidents over the past 10 weeks or so.
What's the response been from Mali? What's it doing about the attacks?
The government's been making some efforts to intervene in the cycle of violence, but it's not really, as we can tell by the rising sort of numbers of incidents, it's not being very effective. So, we are calling on the government as a matter of urgency to really try and get a grip on the situation and to ensure that whoever's committing human rights abuses is brought to account. And that would include government forces too, against whom there are some allegations.
And do you think that the fightings are going to get worse as we get closer to elections?
Well, we hope not, but the trend is certainly upwards. So I'm not sure how much is linked to election. It's a very complex situation. We've also got this sort of al-Qaeda-linked group, Jamaat Nusrat al-Islam al-Muslimin, which is kind of working or is perceived to be close to the Fulani communities in some places, and that's supposedly motivating attacks against the Fulani. But they are clearly exploiting, these extremists are clearly exploiting the situation. The enmities between some of the local groups are historical. I mean, they go back many years and are rooted in competition over land and over resources and so on. But the extremist element that's come in has clearly changed the character and perhaps made it much more dangerous.
Rupert Colville there from the UN Human Rights Commission. Now, despite concerns about the transparency of preparations for Zimbabwe's first elections without former strongman Robert Mugabe, the country's opposition MDC party said it will not be walking away from polls. Its leader, Nelson Mandela, called on other African states, though, to help make sure the vote is above board. Take a look.
Nelson Chamisa, the leader of the opposition in Zimbabwe, said he had evidence that police officers did not vote freely.
Our officers were asked to vote in the presence of their seniors. That vote was not secret. We have this information. Officers are phoning us. They are complaining. We have raised these issues, and this has continued. So we would want this ballot to be made invalid, nullified.
Like in many countries, police officers in Zimbabwe vote before the general public so they can be on duty on election day. The poll will take place on July the 30th, while officers voted last week near Bulawayo in tense circumstances.
Are they voting freely? Are the officers voting freely? That's why the question is. We want to see them cast their votes freely. They are Zimbabweans. It's their democratic right to cast their votes freely.
The Electoral Commission rejected the opposition's allegations. On Tuesday, Nelson Chamisa also called on the regional bloc SADC and on the African Union to ensure the election will be fair. The European Union is sending observers. Chamisa's main rival will be the incumbent Emmerson Mnangagwa, who became president in November when Robert Mugabe was ousted after a brief military takeover. Mugabe had been in control of Zimbabwe for 37 years.
Well, that's it for Eye on Africa for now. Thanks very much for joining us, and do so again if you can. Take care.